Imagine a river carving the same path for centuries, and then, without a single human hand, it begins to change course. It actually happened in Yellowstone, not because of a flood, not an earthquake, but because of 14 wolves. 14 individuals in a park spanning more than 9,000 square kilometers triggered a cascade no scientist had dared predict. How could a predator, by simply existing, reshape the behavior of trees, the course of rivers, and the architecture of an entire living world? The story begins in 1995, the first time in 70 years that a wolf's howl echoed through the Lamar Valley. Before 1926, gray wolves had roamed Yellowstone for tens of thousands of years, an inseparable thread woven into the living fabric of the land. They lived alongside elk, bison, and hundreds of other species, a balance so delicate it had taken millennia to build. Then, in the early 20th century, a government predator elimination program wiped the wolf population from Yellowstone completely. The last wolf in Yellowstone was shot in 1926, and from that moment, the park began to change in ways no one immediately recognized. Without wolves, the elk multiplied unchecked grazing wherever they wished, including the fragile vegetation lining the riverbanks. Willows, aspens, and cottonwoods along the rivers were stripped to their roots, and the bare banks began to erode, slowly and silently. Without roots to hold the soil, the rivers spread and shallowed, losing the deep bends and channels that had taken centuries to form. Ecologists call this a trophic cascade, when the absence of one species pulls the rest of the system apart, link by link. But at the time, no one fully understood this, because no one had ever watched it happen in real time, right before their eyes. By the 1990s, pressure from scientists and conservation groups had grown strong enough to push an unprecedented decision. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed reintroducing gray wolves into Yellowstone not as a small experiment, but as a deliberate act of ecological restoration. The proposal ignited fierce debate. Ranchers feared for their livestock, hunters worried about elk, and many local communities pushed back hard. But decades of accumulated scientific evidence pointed clearly to one conclusion: Yellowstone was missing an irreplaceable link. After years of debate and planning, the decision was finally approved, and a small group of biologists began preparing for what they called the return. In January of 1995, 14 gray wolves were captured in Alberta, Canada, and transported by plane and truck southward toward a valley that had been silent for 70 years. Each wolf was fitted with a radio frequency tracking collar, so scientists could follow every movement across the park. When the pens were opened in the Lamar Valley, no one knew what would happen next, not even those who had spent entire careers making this moment possible. The first wolves stepped out cautiously, noses lifted to the air, then moved slowly into the open meadow, reading the landscape like a book written entirely in scent. In the first weeks, many wolves stayed close to the release site, but gradually they began marking territory, forming packs, and rewriting the rules of the land. And then, what no one had predicted began to happen, not all at once, but step by step. So quietly, it was almost invisible at first. Yellowstone ecologists were accustomed to field documentation, but what they began recording in the late 90s made them check their data again and again. The elk hadn't disappeared, but their behavior had changed completely, and that behavioral shift was the key to everything that followed. Before the wolves returned, elk grazed everywhere, including valley floors and riversides that they now began to actively avoid. Scientists call this the landscape of fear, where a predator's presence doesn't just kill prey, it reshapes the entire geography of where prey dares to live. The riverbanks and low valley floors, where elk had grazed comfortably for decades, suddenly became dangerous zones where the herds no longer lingered. And the moment the elk moved away, nature rushed to fill the silence with a speed that astonished everyone watching. Willows began to regrow along the river margins, reaching heights tall enough to shade the water within just a few summers. Aspens and cottonwoods, gnawed to stumps for decades, began to reach heights beyond the reach of any elk's jaw. Within fewer than 10 years, long stretches of Yellowstone's rivers were canopied again, something scientists had not expected to see within their own lifetimes. But trees didn't just restore beauty, they began performing their engineering role within the system. And that role changed everything downstream. Tree roots gripped the banks, slowing erosion, retaining the soil that had been washing away for decades along riverbanks stripped bare. Shade from the recovering canopy cooled the water temperature, and this had an unexpected consequence for the native trout. The native cutthroat trout thrived in cooler water, and their numbers began to recover alongside the trees that shaded the rivers above them. More fish meant more food for bears, eagles, and otters, species that began returning or increasing in number along the same rivers. A chain reaction had begun, and no ecologist standing at its head had predicted how far it would run. Most remarkable in the entire chain was the beaver, a species whose absence had been overlooked for decades, but whose role was that of a second river engineer. Beavers need willows to eat and to build. No willows meant no beavers. No beavers meant no dams, and no dams meant no wetlands. As willows recovered, beavers returned, and their small dams began creating dozens of new ponds and wetlands along the park's streams. Each new wetland was a complete habitat shelter for insects, amphibians, water birds, and hundreds of species dependent on still water. And all of it, the beavers, the wetlands, the birds, had begun because 14 wolves changed the fear living inside an elk herd. To understand why the wolf's return had such power, we need to look deeper at the biological mechanism behind what scientists call a trophic cascade. In every ecosystem, certain species exert an influence far greater than their numbers suggest. These are called keystone species. The concept of the keystone species was first proposed by ecologist Robert Payne in 1969, after he conducted a simple but revolutionary experiment on a rocky shoreline in Washington state. Payne removed a single species of sea star from his study area, and within a few years, the entire community collapsed from 15 species to just one. That sea star, Pisaster ocraceus, was a keystone species, and when it vanished, the diversity of the entire community dissolved with it. Gray wolves in Yellowstone were the keystone of a terrestrial ecosystem, but their mechanism of influence was far more layered than a sea star eating mussels. Wolves didn't just kill elk, they changed how elk moved, where elk stopped, how long elk stayed in one place. They reshaped the spatial behavior of prey. This is the non-lethal effect where a predator reshapes an ecosystem, not primarily by consuming prey, but by altering the behavior of every prey animal within its range. GPS collar studies showed that Yellowstone elk dramatically altered their daily movement paths after wolves arrived, avoiding open ground near rivers entirely. River corridors that elk had occupied all day were now used only at night or avoided entirely, and that was all the trees needed to begin their recovery. Remarkably, even areas wolves rarely visited showed vegetation recovery because the elk could never be certain which places were truly safe. That uncertainty, that nameless fear, was the wolf's most powerful ecological tool, more powerful even than fang or speed. Ecologist Joel Berger spent years studying the behavior of herbivores in areas long emptied of predators, and what he found was deeply troubling. Large herbivores like moose and pronghorn had lost the instinctive response to predator scent after generations without any contact with wolves or cougars. They called this ecological amnesia, a species forgetting its own threats, because those threats had been absent for so long. Yellowstone elk had carried this ecological amnesia for nearly 70 years, and the wolves' return reactivated an evolutionary memory buried deep in their bodies. Within a few generations, elk that could read dangerous terrain would survive more often, and the wolf's selection pressure would once again sculpt the anatomy of fear in the species. This was evolution, in real time, observable within the lifetimes of the scientists studying it. That is extraordinarily rare, but one species, neither prey nor plant, was affected by the wolf's return in ways even more astonishing. Yellowstone grizzlies began shifting their foraging behavior, taking advantage of wolf-killed elk carcasses, a food source they had not had access to for many decades. Critically, pregnant females and nursing mothers gained access to this protein-rich food source at the most important moments of their reproductive cycle. Cub survival rates in Yellowstone rose noticeably in the years following the wolves' return, scientists pointing directly to the richer food supply from carcasses. Ravens, bald eagles, and coyotes all benefited, converging on wolf-killed carcasses like mobile nutrient hubs distributed across the ecosystem. Each carcass was a localized nutrient explosion, concentrating energy from one elk and radiating it outward through a chain of dozens of different species. Even the nutrients from bones, dissolving slowly over time, seeped into the soil and fed the vegetation rooted directly above them. But among all the consequences of the wolves' return, one went entirely unpredicted, one that, when published, made scientists doubt their own data. The rivers began to change their physical shape, not because anyone dug channels or built dams, but because elk behavior had allowed vegetation to grow back. Fresh tree roots along the banks made the edges firmer. Rivers began to run deeper rather than spreading wide, and the currents started forming new bends and curves. Geomorphologists call this channel consolidation, when a river in a state of fragmentation and erosion begins to concentrate into a single, deeper, more stable course. The result was rivers that ran in more elegant curves, retained water longer through dry seasons, and created deeper habitats for fish and aquatic life. This was what inspired British ecologist George Monbiot to coin the phrase that became one of the most celebrated concepts in modern ecology. He called it "How Wolves Change Rivers," and his talk on the phenomenon became one of the most watched introductions to ecology ever recorded. But not all scientists agreed that wolves were the primary driver, and that debate deepened our understanding of just how complex ecosystems truly are. Some researchers noted that changes in rainfall, reduced drought, and the growth of active restoration projects also contributed to the recovery of riparian vegetation. Science is rarely a clean story with a single cause, and the Yellowstone wolf story is no exception, even if the wolves' role cannot be denied. A 2012 study by scientist Erin Lehman showed that in certain zones of the park, wolf pressure on elk directly correlated with willow regeneration density, but in other areas, particularly where open terrain gave elk more escape routes, the behavioral effect was weaker and vegetation recovery slower. This taught us that geography is a critical variable in trophic cascades, that ecosystems don't respond uniformly, but respond according to terrain. More than 30 years of data have now been collected from the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction, the richest, long-term data set on trophic cascades ever recorded. Wolf numbers in the park have fluctuated over time, from a peak of around 170 individuals in 2015 to around 95 in recent years. Even at those smaller numbers, their ecological influence remained clear because the geography of fear does not require large numbers. It only requires presence. And if all of this happened from 14 wolves in a single park, the next question forces you to rethink the entire way we manage the natural world. The Yellowstone story inspired a new ecological movement called rewilding, the idea that sometimes the best way to protect nature is simply to let it restore itself. Rewilding is not simply leaving nature alone. It is restoring the missing keystone species so that natural chains can operate again without continuous human intervention. In Scotland, conservation organizations are now seriously discussing reintroducing grey wolves into the Caledonian forest, where red deer are stripping woodland, in the same way elk once did at Yellowstone. In Europe, grey wolves have naturally expanded from Italy into France, Germany, and Belgium. And along their migration routes, ecologists are tracking the same familiar signals. Wild deer began avoiding certain woodland patches, trees began recovering, and German researchers recorded changes in plant composition along wolf corridors. A 2021 study from the University of Amsterdam, tracking wolf expansion in Northern Europe, found that tree regeneration density increased by an average of 12% in wolf-present zones compared to wolf-absent ones. Not every reintroduction succeeds. Wolves released in Arizona and New Mexico under the Mexican Wolf Program faced very different challenges and far lower survival rates. This reminds us that Yellowstone is not a formula to copy into every ecosystem. It is evidence of nature's capacity to recover when given the right conditions. Yellowstone's success depended on multiple simultaneous factors: a sufficient area, an elk herd large enough for wolves to survive without touching livestock, and long-term political commitment. And though scientists debate the precise extent of wolf impact, no one can argue with this. Yellowstone in 2025 is a fundamentally different place from Yellowstone in 1994. Willows and aspens now stand taller than 3 meters along many river stretches, where 20 years before there was only bare mud and eroding soil. The beaver population grew from a single documented pair in 1996 to hundreds of individuals, with more than 90 active dams recorded inside the park. The number of bird species recorded in the park increased substantially, reflecting the recovery of both vegetation and water systems, the two factors that determine bird diversity in most ecosystems. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is not the numbers, it is the speed. All of this happened within fewer than 30 years, within a single human generation. This means someone born in 1995, the same year as those first wolves, can stand in the Lamar Valley today and witness the entire transformation with their own eyes. Nature, when given the chance, can heal faster than we imagined, and that speed is one of the most astonishing discoveries Yellowstone has given to science. But the deeper question Yellowstone poses is not whether nature can recover, it is how much we are willing to allow it to. Yellowstone's wolves did not simply change an ecosystem. They changed how we understand predation, the complexity of living networks, and our own place within them. We once believed humans were the only species capable of reshaping a landscape by design, but Yellowstone proved that 14 wolves could do the same thing simply by being alive. That raises a philosophical question. Ecologists still debate: should we see ourselves as managers of nature, or simply as one species among many that shapes the world? Yellowstone's answer is not simple, but it suggests our role may not be constant intervention, but knowing when to step back and let nature do what it has known how to do for millions of years. Return now to that river, the one you imagined at the beginning of this story, the one no human hand had touched, the one that began to change course. Now you know why it changed, not by the invisible hand of nature, but by a chain of relationships pulled back to their correct tension by the return of a single species. The thread ran from wolf to elk, from elk to tree, from tree to riverbank, from bank to current, invisible as a filament, yet strong enough to reshape the geography of a place. And it means that nature is not a collection of separate species, but a web of relationships where even a single node, removed or restored, can change the shape of the whole. We live on a planet where thousands of keystone species have been lost or are threatened, and each one may be a wolf holding some river somewhere in its proper shape. The question is not whether we can restore them. The question is whether we will recognize what we are losing before the rivers begin to change course. That river you imagined at the start of this story, it is still flowing through Yellowstone right now, curving through green willow banks, and somewhere on a distant ridge, a wolf is watching.